This is session 4 with Regis McKenna, and today we're going to talk exclusively about Apple and your relationship with Steve Jobs and your work during the birth and growth of the company.
Okay.
Very exciting.
It was a great period of time, yeah. People do refer to it as the golden age of Silicon Valley.
Yes.
Yeah, 80s.
Well, and since you got to know Steve probably as well as anyone and worked as closely with him as anyone during that first 10-year period, there's a lot for us to talk about.
Yes.
Talk about your first encounter with Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak.
Well, there's even some different speculations about what I did and what I didn't do. I mean, I keep getting emails from editors saying, did you throw them out of your office? Did you this sort of thing? And nothing quite as dramatic as all that really happened. We were growing very fast as a company, and largely because there were so many different new companies. And I've shown you a list of the companies that we were working with, and it was getting longer and longer. So I did have people who would sort of screen new people coming in or new potential clients, and they were people who'd been around the industry a while and so forth. So they weren't, just willy-nilly looking at personalities or whatever.
And just to be clear, you started your firm in 1970. The time period we're talking about right now is about 1976.
The end of 76, yeah.
And so in that 6 years, you had seen phenomenal growth as a company.
Right.
With all of your client representation.
Right. And we were still very small. I mean, I didn't start like a typical venture in Silicon Valley where somebody gave you $5 million and you went out and built an initial infrastructure. We were making money and hiring and making money, then hiring and making. So we were putting the cart in front of the horse, or we were putting the horse in front of the cart rather, and trying to grow along with our business. And so it wasn't a matter of speculating on things that we would partially finance through work and services. But Steve told me later that he had called Intel and asked them who was doing their work. And they referred him to Regis McKenna. And he told me that at first he thought it was 2 people. So he thought he would call one of us. And
either Regis or McKenna.
Yeah. And I think it was probably came in and went to, I don't know, I think it went to Frank Burge. Frank was a longtime Silicon Valley person. He was in the publishing business. He came to work for me. He was, I think he came out of Fairchild originally. He had been in a couple companies here. He'd been around a long, long time, and he was a really excellent writer and so forth. So I think he and probably a fellow by the name of Don Coburn, who had come from both Fairchild and National and worked as an assistant to Charlie Spork. They were reviewing some of these companies and suggested to me that I meet with them. So we set up an appointment, and they came in, and
at that point, they really weren't a company. They were
they weren't incorporated.
They
They were not incorporated, but they did have the Apple I, and people had seen it, and it was on the marketplace, and I'll digress in a second, but this people think of it as a sort of a new phenomena. What was new was the growth of an industry. What wasn't new, that there were people making hobby computers. There were Heathkits, there were things like Heathkits, and there were 2 companies out there in the Valley who were doing fairly well selling to hobbyists. It was Altair and IMSI, and both of them were using Intel processors. And so that's how I first got introduced to them, because of the Intel processors in them. And Intel was always looking for applications, and we helped them write application notes. So there was a knowledge of that this industry was emerging somewhere, or there was technology out there that enabling smaller and smaller computing devices. But they came in and they wanted to speak largely about their launching the Apple II, which was still in the planning stages. And Wozniak had written an article on what the Apple II was all about, how it was designed, what it could do, what features he had planned to put into it, and things of that nature. And they felt that that was sort of marketing, that if they published that article in, say, Byte magazine, they could sit back and orders would roll in. And
Is that why they came to you? They were primarily looking for your help in getting the article published?
right.
I see.
I'm assuming because that's what they came in and talked about. I don't think that their really knowledge of, say, what a marketing program or even an advertising public relations program really, I don't think they went that far as to know exactly what that was. They really didn't have any touch with that or any experience dealing with that. In Woz's case, at HP or at Atari. They would have been they were just at the technician level type of thing. So I don't think they would have had exposure to that world. And so I looked at the article and my feeling was that because I subscribed to Byte magazine, I read it as best I could, and it was engineers talking to engineers. The articles were inside talk, and I felt very strongly that they had to broaden that audience, and so they needed to have a publication that spoke to the next level and the next level up. People that were maybe professionals, people who were disciplined enough in their work habits to spend time at a computer, because clearly these computers took time. They were not plug and play. They were, you had to know a certain amount of programming, and a lot of things went wrong. And to be able to sort of go in and understand that, and then know the people or the places where you could go to get help, that was all part of an inner knowledge kind of thing that occurred among the homebrew club and other hobby organizations. And there were quite a few across the country. There were quite a few of these hobby organizations around building your own computer. Was
it your sense that this was an emerging market that was really worth tapping into?
No, I don't think that I think that most of these kind of predictions about future markets are, the only way you really know is looking in the rearview mirror. And I always say, the tipping point is seen in a rearview mirror. It's never seen in advance. When people say, well, there's going to be a tipping point and you can figure out what it is, I just think that's baloney. The real tipping point is whenever you look in the rearview mirror and you see what's behind you. And if it's happening and you can tap into it quickly, which is why you have a lot of entrepreneurial companies grow fast, is because they are tapping into the technology that's current at the time, and they are taking advantage of it, because most of the larger companies don't take advantage of the latest leading edge kinds of technologies. They usually wait to see how, whether or not it's secure, whether it's reliable, whether it's been around a while but it's been proven, and rather it's been reproducible and scalable. And so they'll wait. An example of this was IBM. It was said, and I got it from a number of people when I wrote the book on IBM, was that IBM would not go into a market that was less than $100 million. And indeed, they went into the PC business when Apple announced that they hit $100 million. And that was in 1980. So then that was when IBM decided to get into the market. So it had to be something that for large companies get into. But small companies do it because they really don't have anything to lose. They can start a new technology and take the risk. And generally there was venture money here to back that risk up. And so, the risk capital is really what creates most leading edge innovations. So Apple hadn't been to that point yet. They hadn't even raised any money. They were, I think they sold their Steve, I understood, sold his calculator to get money to build the parts for Apple I. And I don't know, somebody said Steve sold his Volkswagen or something else to get money for that. So they were financing it themselves, and so they hadn't gotten to the point where we need investors and so forth to back this company and to put together an organization.
And what sort of impression did they make on you face to face?
Well, they both had cutoffs on and Birkenstocks and long hair, and Steve had what I called a Ho Chi Minh beard. It was very stringy, and he had long hair. They looked, when I referred them to Don Valentine and they went up to see him, he called me back and said, "Why did you send me these renegades from the human race?" Because Don was always sort of preppy kind of guy, so but in the Valley you cannot judge people by first impression, and and you learn that very, very early. I mean, this is not the first startup I was with. I had been with dozens of startups. I had been in the business now. I'd been in the electronics business since '65. Actually working in companies. So this was 67 or 76. So I'd been around a while. I'd seen a lot of companies, and you see a lot of strange people. And indeed I did. I mean, at National, I met with Bob Weiler, who was one of the wildest, strangest persons that ever lived in this valley. And he's sort of gone to mythical history now. But certainly he was much more bizarre than Steve Orr was, but very successful genius. And so it's not unusual to see people like that. And today it's almost all software engineers.
What you've written about this in other places. You said, I realized his ripped jeans and long hair masked an intelligent, articulate, and genuinely enthusiastic young man. And so he struck you, it seems, from the way that you've written about it in other places, as unique.
Yeah, Steve was certainly the person that was the forward person in the room. I mean, Woz is somewhat, somewhat shy and introspective, but Jobs is out there. He's talking all the time, and he's always trying to convince you of something. And when I looked over the article and I said it has to be rewritten, Woz said I don't want any. I think he either said PR guy or ad guy rewriting, touching my material, and that's not even strange. I mean, that's a lot of people. Bob Noyce did not like people rewriting his stuff. So, or authoring it for him and then having him put his name on it. I don't think that's unusual. It's just that there was this sort of reticence to seek help, and since they were coming for nothing else but that, I just told them, there's nothing I can do for them, and so they left. I don't remember all the details or all we talked, but they did leave, and I do know that Steve called back, and which almost everybody can attest to the fact that once he gets, introduced to you, he doesn't let you go. And so Steve and I met, and I have little notes here and there, Jobs in my notebook. I don't have a lot of detailed notes, but throughout that year, I probably met him 2 or 3 times. And basically, when we talked about his vision of reaching students, reaching teachers, reaching doctors and lawyers and people of a higher professional, vocations, that he could get a market going, and his vision was certainly right on. I mean, it was what he didn't have yet was a product to do it, and that was going to be the Apple II. If it weren't for Steve Jobs, and I've said this before, with all due respect to Wozniak's genius in creating that machine, I don't think the Apple II would have ever succeeded. And Time magazine, in fact, said, Steve appeared on the cover of Time in the early days of the 80s, and in that article, they say that Steve Jobs may well have been the one person that actually launched the industry by himself. And it was because he was a relentless enthusiast and evangelist for the personal computer.
Did you, based on that follow-up phone call, agree to work for them at that point? Was that what persuaded you?
Well, certainly with Steve, we started. I mean, there wasn't sort of most of our clients didn't have any kind of formal arrangements.
It's not like someone dropped a green flag and, okay, suddenly you're working
Yeah, you're with
together.
us, and we're going to go.
Yeah.
It happened gradually. I think after Valentine, Mike Markula became involved. Mike started putting structure to things because he put in the early meeting. Mike started talking about potential budgets, and we put together a budget of what it would take. Mike doubled the budget, which was kind of interesting. I mean, it was also a foresight because he felt that it was going to take a lot more money to get it off the ground. So we were trying to be frugal and not spend their money a lot because we knew they didn't have a lot. But it was interesting that Mike said, let's double that budget. And that was really kind of the let's go. And that's where, from there on, we had as I wrote in my plan, things to do would be build the logo, develop some advertising, and start do what I used to call a backgrounder, which was in fact, those notes from my book are really sort of the outline of a backgrounder on the company that my people would prepare. It was sort of like an analyst report. I tried not to put a lot of adjectives in it, just here's what we are and here's what we offer the world.
There's this very interesting entry from your notebooks dated December 4th where it really is an insight, I think, into the way that you worked and thought with companies like this, because you talk about they got together on April 1st, 76, incorporated January 3rd, 77, or would be incorporated because this was still 76 at that point, where the market would be, and the Altair and the IMSI. It's a very, and people who are seeing the oral history on video will be seeing copies of these pages. It's a very thorough document. Does this represent your process? Is this the way that you went about with every company?
Yeah, I have. With Intel, I have a lot of this very similar kinds of documents, but it would be around the microprocessor, because at Intel they were in business. They had products coming out, and the processor was the one that they were investing most heavily in, but not seeing a lot of return. So the microprocessor, they called it the microcomputer in those days. The chip was actually called the microcomputer, not the processor. And that was the sort of hope of the future. And I have a feeling that that's one of the reasons why Noyce was, sort of happy to actually have us come on and do their business. But that business was a phone call that said, you want to work for us? And I said yes, and we did it. But just to give you a little bit of background, it goes back to 1965. And I did bring this. This is, I don't know if you can see this, but that was the Victor Comptometer's 3900 calculator. And that machine was, you can see there's 39 MOS chips on there. So they were able to reduce all the componentry in an electromechanical machine, thousands of parts down to just those 39. Now, this as a product failed because the processes were not mature enough to handle the complexity of the chips. But if you look at this product, it looks like the Apple II. Mm-hmm. The Apple II doesn't have the monitor on it. You had to put the monitor on top, but in fact, it's the size of an Apple II's body.
Yeah, and especially from the side, you can see that flat top and the sloping keyboard. It's the form factor is exactly the same.
So Joel Karp, who was at GME at that time, and I was at GME. Joe Karp became the first MOS engineer at Intel. And so, how it takes a village to raise a child. It takes Silicon Valley to raise a new company, because there's so many different knowledge points that are coming to play on things. So, sort of your timing as a company, the kinds of people you surround you with, all of that makes for a successful company. And indeed, having these other people experience this, even though in failure, they went on. In fact, most of the team that worked for Joel Karp came to work at Intel. So the processor really grew out of an evolution of years of development and knowledge development on behalf of various engineers. And so Apple really, and it was Steve who knew about the processors at Intel, and I think they probably experimented with that originally. Apple went its own way for various reasons. I don't think they used Intel in the first processors, or in the Apple II, but it's the whole idea grew out of Intel.
How did you begin to work with them initially to put together a marketing plan for a whole new thing? I mean, this had to cross the chasm, to use a phrase, from the hobbyist market to the general purpose market. Was that how you and Jobs thought about it in the very beginning?
No, it really wasn't possible at that time. You had to deal with the technology you were given, and so to move it to from the hobbyist or the people who were willing to spend time, and there were a lot of people who were willing to spend time. I mean, literally millions of people were willing to sit down and learn basic programming and things of that nature. But the notes that I have there in terms of putting together a marketing plan wasn't coming out of some imagination. It was coming out of looking around and saying, who's out there doing stuff now? What would we have to do? For example, in those notes, I put what are the potential distribution channels? And one of them I put Apple stores. So that was in 1976 that we were talking about Apple stores. And I have notes later on showing, I talked Apple stores at a lot of my presentations to Apple because there really wasn't a good channel out there for the personal computer. They became, general electronics stores, and they looked like supermarkets, but they had a lot of electronics in it. And once IBM got in, the retail stores were dominated by the Intel and Microsoft software. So Apple was then pushed into sort of a corner of the store. So for Apple to sort of break out and say, here's our own thing, really required a new strategy. And I went around to basically, when we were doing work with Apple, I went around to music stores, I went around to stereo, I went around to all the, and the Byte Shop was a client of ours. So I knew what the hobby stores were like, and I had worked with them through Intel and bubble wrapping the single board computer for kits to design computers. And so it was sort of community knowledge that's in there, not my imagination.
Sure.
or me having certain knowledge that other people didn't. It was community information. And generally it came out of, me and Steve and probably Markla and others sitting around and talking about, now what are we going to need to do, and somebody putting out an idea, and then it grew and grew, and so it developed long lists of things to do.
Is that how it worked for you with them as a process? You'd sit down together and spend hours together around the table and talk a little bit about what your work style was like.
Well, that was true with all the clients.
Sure.
I mean, generally it would be. I always thought the technical people had some of the best marketing ideas in the Valley but they never were able to express them out loud in the public. But in fact, behind the scenes, and when you're preparing materials and you're looking for new ways to bring a product to market, the technical people have really a lot of genius behind what they're doing, and they do understand a lot about the customer. And so they are one, and by and large, because they were technical and they were people who could also use the products that you were bringing to market. So in effect, the people in the community that you're working with become the best sources for developing new ideas for marketing. Mm-hmm. And it was conversational. It grew out of that, of taking notes, a lot of whiteboard talk, and a lot of those kind of meetings. And as companies grew, you generally added some product marketing people, and that they were sort of the workhorses of most companies, including Apple and Intel and everyone else. And you spent enormous amounts of time with those people. And it wasn't just during the workday. It was, at lunches, breakfasts, whenever you could meet at each other's homes, that sort of thing. So it was an ongoing conversation that was non-ending and always adaptive. And so you're always able to add new material to it. It's not like it is today. And so I think what's hard is for people to imagine from now to today where things are very structured. If I were doing business today, I wouldn't have been working with a Noyce or more, or Steve Jobs and Wozniak and people like that. I would be working coming in somewhere down the line. Maybe I'd meet those people, but it would be you'd have to go through 2 or 3 levels of people. Mm-hmm. And so you're generally in a cubicle somewhere trying to figure out this piece of the puzzle without knowing the whole puzzle. There, you could see the whole puzzle laid up in front of you.
I was just thinking that it was a very organic process, the way that you were working at that point.
And as I said, again, I'll go back, but when I was at GME, maybe 100 people in the company, but you knew them all. And they were, building the wafers, and they were making calculators at one end. So I knew everybody in between. I watched the process. I could, walk down the line and see every one of these steps. I could ask questions. And so it was not isolated from a new person coming in and seeing the whole process in front of them. That's the, Bob Noyce used to use the automobile and say, as an example, and say, today when you open the hood of a car, you can't figure out anything because nothing's visible. It's all encapsulated and covered and epoxied or whatever. He said, but back then you could watch the pistons, how they worked. You could see the spark, where the sparks were created. You could see everything about it. And you could pretty much figure out how it worked. And true with the old-fashioned radios. If you looked in the back of them, I know our radio at home had a circuit diagram in the back. So, you could see, not really understanding how the tubes worked, you could at least see the circuitry and understand that it was this little system that was at work back there. It wasn't magic. And so when you started in these companies, it was a special era, and that so many people really got their college degree, their MBA, and their doctorates here in the Valley just by watching the technology and being close to it.
From your perspective, from a marketing perspective, why did the Apple II succeed so quickly?
Well, first of all, it was the MSI and the Altair, and maybe we can show pictures of them.
Yes.
They were black boxes, and they were programmed by switches, little switches that you on the front, lots of little switches and lights, and so there wasn't a keyboard, there wasn't a sort of an understanding of how you'd have to know basic computing and basic machine code to be able to work with one. And the Apple II really did away with all that. It was a magical instrument in that it had a keyboard It allowed you to, it had basic programs that you could follow, and anybody could sort of buy it and start doing things if they spent a little time educating themselves. It was also an open system. It had, you could take the back off of it, the top in this case, right off the top, and it had 7 card slots in it. And those 7 card slots could be anybody's. They could be adapted. So people were building their own circuit cards and placing it in there to do a specific task using the computer power of the Apple II. So that took it into a wide range of industries and businesses where people could specify their application. And that really, I think, was one of the things that made it most successful, was being an open system. It's ironic because that's how Apple started. It's not how they continued, because the Mac was not an open system.
It is ironic.
Yeah. So I think that was one of the very key points, is that open system.
Were you surprised at how quickly it took off?
You know, I don't think that sort of conversation goes on. I think you're happy. I don't know that you're surprised, in that you're usually so busy, either doing things or doing the next thing that's required, or you're putting out fires. So once you have a product that's successful that requires, there's lots of peripherals and add-ons and things of that nature, and then everybody's always working on the next generation, the Apple III, that, you know, you're happy with what's happening. Apple did celebrate, and I have a little cube on my desk at home that says $100 million, what does it say? Something like award to the marketing team, $100 million Apple achievement. And that was in 1980. So by 1980, they were $100 million, which was phenomenal success.
Yeah.
So,
Talk about that period, Regis, when they had to go from incorporation in 1977, January of 77, to $100 million in revenue in 1980. Pretty phenomenal growth. What did you observe about the company, the people involved, how it handled all of that? I mean, as you say, everyone is happy. There's also a fair amount of just tumult inside a company like that, isn't there?
yeah, because I think, particularly in this case, where its founding was in this hobby market, which was by itself sort of an eclectic market. You couldn't say who a hobbyist was in the PC, because it could be people in any professions who just had a knack for technology, and they may have been a doctor, or they may have been a teacher. A lot of teachers were interested in the Mac. But there was Apple at that time was almost like a shopping mall. There were, every day you'd go in there, you'd see new people, and and you wouldn't know whether they worked for Apple or not, because I know a lot of teachers people would find their way there, and they'd just come over and start talking to people and start interfacing about their idea or what they would. So it was really a kind of a crossroads of discussion. And a lot of the people that came on were out of the semiconductor industry. They weren't from the computer industry as such. And I think had they been from the computer industry, let's say from digital equipment or NCR or IBM, they probably would have been more structured. It probably would have talked about how to build larger and larger peripherals and how to build it into the enterprise. But it didn't. It stayed down at those grassroots. And so a lot of grassroots people were actually engaged at Apple at that time.
What did you think about that?
It was fun. It was fun. I mean, and Steve, you never know. I mean, he had, I think this was during the Mac days, but, you know, we went in one day and you could hear classical piano being played, and he met a woman who was a classical pianist and brought a piano into the middle, and she would play I don't know, so many days a week, just during the day. So there was always something that was interesting and a surprise, and it's what I loved about my job, is that I never saw or did the same things 2 days in a row. Whereas when I worked at National, you were doing basically the same thing over and over and over again.
And can you talk a little bit about the people involved at that point? Mike Markla obviously was there as the chairman, and Steve was there as the VP of marketing. Wozniak was there as the VP of technology, I guess essentially the CTO of the company. The board was coming together. Can you talk about that 2-year period, let's say, or 3, from 78 to 80, and what you observed?
Well, the new people, because there were some of them that I knew because they had come from the semiconductor industry, and so you had acquaintances there, and you would sort of huddle with these people about what they were doing, and they had things that they wanted to get done. It might have only been a little slice of the pie, but it was what they felt was important. One might have been developing certain applications. One would be developing third-party software interfaces. There were peripheral companies out there that were starting as well. There were monitor companies that wanted to either work with Apple or develop specific monitors that adapted to the Apple. So there were all these other kinds of companies that you could interface with. And you were always on the lookout for, as I said, that somebody who was building a card that had a specific application, either in the medical field or in the science field or in education or wherever. And that became sort of a package that we could put out or promote that around that specific application in order to give people the ideas that the Apple II can be used in a variety of channels. Mm-hmm. It's not just a general purpose computer that anybody can use at this point. It has to be adapted to a specific solution. And but it was always a highly, it wasn't a tense, but it was an intense environment. Lots of people, actions, lots of people working, lots of new ideas being passed around, a lot of really young people. From my viewpoint, although Steve said head of marketing, he was the focal point. He really did sort of assume the mantle of leadership from the very beginning. Now, Markla, I would meet with Mike from time to time. He and his wife were very active at the trade shows. They both manned the Apple booth, as did everybody. So it really was almost like a family affair. Everybody was engaged in every aspect of Apple at that time. It was interesting to see, Markla's wife at the Apple booths helping to, talk to people and hand out literature and do those kinds of things, as well as Mike and others. So, I can't get into very specifics because I don't recall all of them, but I do know the general nature was that it was a highly intensive environment in which there was lots to do.
You said that your beginning in this period, your workday was you'd spend half the day at Intel and half the day at Apple. Yeah. How quickly did that begin? It must have begun almost right away, didn't it?
And then half my day at a dozen other places.
Right. Yeah. It was a 22-hour day.
It really was.
Yeah.
I mean, there were nights that I actually slept on the floor at the office. So because everybody, and particularly, which is I think a huge mistake, is to put my name on the door, because that's the person that they want to talk to, and so.
And if you're not there, then somehow they feel like nothing's getting done.
Well, they feel they're not getting their attention.
Yeah.
So obviously, I had that issue because Intel was a client, Apple was a client, but so was Microsoft, and. Microsoft, I used to say that they didn't compete technologically, but they competed for attention. And if one got something out in the media, the others were upset by it. Steve appeared on Time magazine before Bill Gates, and we were supposedly going to be were the interface, and so that created problems for us with Bill Gates.
How did you manage that?
I didn't. They left us. I mean, and they basically hired my people up in Portland, and set them up in business.
Yeah.
So, Bill was an aggressive competitor, and but Bill then wasn't the same person he is today. Bill went on to bigger and better things, and that was a lot of infighting at those days, and it was for who's king of the hill, who's on first, who gets the most attention. And don't forget now, we talked about this in the previous session, is that the print media was king.
That was everything.
It was everything. There wasn't an internet. Television, pretty much, it was the news program at night. There wasn't any special programs.
And in fact, the way you defined print media, it actually was a very small universe of opinion-making publications,
Right.
wasn't it?
Right. Yeah. It grew into that, but yes. And in each sort of technology segment, there were a key journal that sort of dominated all the others. In the whole aerospace world, I think it was Aviation Week was the magazine, and there were lots and lots of military, and there was a military systems design. There was all sorts of magazines out there, but Aviation Week sort of set the pace of the news. Electronics magazine and electronic news did. It was a while before. It wasn't until the mid '80s that the general press, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and even local papers like the San Jose Mercury News, they were all late into recognizing this as a real industry, or anything in Silicon Valley.
Who was the first? Who did you see actually beginning to understand
Business
the
Week.
magnitude of this?
Business Week.
Business Week.
And that's largely because the editor of Electronics Magazine became the editor of Business Week.
Deliberately, they did that because they understood corporately.
Right. And I think they started, and Fortune, by the way. Fortune magazine, not as a magazine, but Fortune at that time did long, in-depth stories. And they had some science writers that did long stories on Noyce and Moore and on the growth of technology under them, from Fairchild to Intel. There was a guy named Gene Bilinski, who was a technical guy for Fortune for many years, and the Wall Street Journal would give you, there would be a researcher and a journalist, so they worked as a team. That's when they could afford to do that, and the articles would be 10 pages or more. I mean, so they would do lots of research on creating these major pieces that gave you deep insight into the business and into the technology. And but the technology went everything from Polaroid to penicillin. It went that sort of a range of things to look at, and how these things evolved, and how they come about, and who are the key drivers of it. Fortune focused more on the people who did it and the stories behind them. Business Week was much more about the business and the probability of its success. There was also there were some key financial analysts, and one of the most I think influential was a guy named Ben Rosen. Ben Rosen was he was with a small financial firm, but he wrote a newsletter on the semiconductor industry, and it became sort of the one sort of red sheet or yellow sheet that came out every week that you read, and it was all because Ben was a physicist. He understood what was going on, and he could question people and he tried to put out really objective, factual knowledge about the products and their their competitiveness in the marketplace compared with others. And so Ben became somebody who, in the semiconductor industry, started holding little conferences, just small ones. The first one was in his conference room back at, I'm trying to think of the name of the firm, but I don't think it was Morgan Stanley, but it may have been. And there was only a half a dozen people in it. And I know I was in it. And gradually they grew to be fairly substantial conferences with all the industry leaders from around the world. And then when he went to Morgan Stanley, he was one of the first people who introduced the Apple II. And Ben sat on his desk, and he started. I mean, he first thing he did, or one of the early things he did, and I still have a copy of it. Maybe I could find it. Is he used to print out the menu of restaurants in New York City and their ratings. And he had his own ratings and so forth, and the address. It's a long sheet, so it was really nice to take to New York. Mine's all beat up, but it's...
Did you find it was pretty accurate?
Oh, sure. I mean, he took a lot of people. He was a financial analyst. So
he knew what he was doing.
He knew what he was doing. And Ben's really... Well, he later, to jump forward, he later on, when he left Morgan Stanley, he created... he was one of the founders of... Rosen and Seven, LJ7 from Mostek, president of Mostek, the memory company, and they formed a venture firm, which became they were the backers behind Compact, for example, and so they were a very, very successful company, and still are actually. So Ben was somebody who was always on the agenda for traveling to New York. For all technical people, there were several of us. We used to have a little cabal that was there was the technical guy from the Wall Street Journal. There was Dick Schaefer. There was Bob Hinkle from Business Week. There was Ben Rosen, and a few others. And we would always have dinner together, the group of us, and. We did that pretty regularly for a number of years, and just to say that's where a lot of the news, the real news, came out of those meetings. But they were a very influential group.
I want to go back for a minute to something you said, because we're still in this period where we're talking about Apple. It's pre-IPO. The IPO happened in '81, and I'm going to talk about the IPO separately in a minute, but you said a minute ago that the focal point of the business was really Steve at that point.
Well, no, for us.
For you.
Yeah.
And so that's where I wanted to get to, which was there are several questions. One was, as he was progressing and as the business was progressing, what did you perceive he needed from you, and what did you perceive you needed from Steve over time, and how did that growth manifest itself?
Well, when you look at a plan, and we'd always put together somewhat of a plan for the following year or the budget and so forth, there were always let's say it was an advertising program. That wasn't done in isolation, nor was it done us sitting back in our offices, coming and say, "What do you think about this?" I never did believe in that. I believed that it was part of the team was the people you're working with, and so Steve was part of all our creative sessions, and so true was planning. So if I had a team of people that would work with Apple, we'd meet with him, and. Or he would be in the room. And so Steve was somewhat unique in that he was very creative. He had a lot of ideas, some of them very wild ideas. And so he was very comfortable sitting there talking with copywriters and creative directors and so forth, and articulating to them what I used to call engineering baby talk, which was, without getting into the bits and bytes, he was able to put out there the benefits and the features and all of. He didn't necessarily call them that, but he was able to talk in plain language, and he did have a vision, and so. And of course, that always appealed to the more creative people anyway. That someone who came in would talk about their vision, which was sometimes made for long meetings because sometimes it led from everybody's vision and on and on and on, and it didn't really end up going anywhere. But it ended up in the working relationship getting stronger. And so Steve spent a fair amount of time at my company.
And you and he spent a lot of one-on-one time.
We did a lot of things together, yes. We traveled together. Went to New York numerous times. We always stayed at the St. Regis Hotel, which was where I stayed for years because that's where I said people could find me. And we would go down to the village for dinner and then walk back, which is a fairly long walk.
That is a long walk.
Yeah. And because I think St. Regis is at 55th and 5th, so we had to walk all the way from pretty much, Wall Street up to there. Yeah. It wasn't just talking about the business, but talking about a lot of things. One of the random sort of things Steve once asked me was, did I ever think that Apple would be bigger than Intel? So he was obviously thinking about building a business, and he had various companies in the Valley that he admired very much. Hewlett Packard was one. Intel was certainly one, if not the one that he really most admired, and largely because of Noyce and more. And he got to meet them. Ann Bowers was Bob Noyce's, eventually became Bob's wife. Was the head of HR at Intel, and then became the head of HR at Apple. So there was some cross conversation there. And Ann says that I was the first one that really introduced her to Steve, and so that led to them. And then they all live around each other. I mean, we all live within 5 miles of each other. So it wasn't difficult to have meetings and even to have dinners at each other's homes and that sort of thing. So it was a real small community of people who knew each other and who were comfortable with each other.
There was a moment in 1980, you wrote about this in your article about Apple, when there was a reorganization where Steve was maintained as vice chairman of the board, but he lost the title of chief R&D officer. And you wrote, there's a sentence in that explanation where you write about Steve never fit into traditional forms. He was truly creative and moved beyond boundaries. What were you thinking about at that particular moment when it seemed like the company was always struggling to fit Steve within its structure, or the structure forming to fit Steve. How did you view all that? And I'm sure you and he had conversations about it too at the time.
Yeah, well, I'm a student of business and marketing. I've read everything, and I have a collection of business and marketing books going back to the 30s, and read a lot of those books about how the structure was formed and so forth. And of course, Taylor, what's his first name? I forget his name. Who really created the structure for business and manufacturing. It was the one who went to Japan and taught Japan how to build their manufacturing entities, and then was followed here in the U.S. But it was based upon each station having their job done and then passing it on to the next. And so if you look at that structure, it was established back in the early part of the 20th century. That's the way the education system was modeled. You put people into rows, you test them, you find out where they're supposed to fit, and then everyone passes the same test or not, and then they move up a level. And so it's a manufacturing model, and I used to talk about that in my talks. And And it's true with business, that everything is passed from one to the other. And in fact, that's where many big companies break down, because these individual cubicles or boxes on an organizational chart become silos of domiciles, and people really make that the end all. And they don't see the whole process, so it's passed off. And many times you see a product that is not developed for manufacturing. So then at Intel, they started putting those two groups together so that the people who were developing and the people who were manufacturing became many of the same people. Now they were able to move that process much more smoothly from development to manufacturing. And that's breaking down those lines. And so I think that if you think about that in the context, Steve would cross boundaries, because he wouldn't, if he had to pick up the phone to call somebody, and this guy had a particularly high level in a position like Dave Packard, he'd pick up the phone and call him. He wouldn't go according to protocol. He wouldn't call his secretary and try to make an appointment, and then he wouldn't try to have introductions to one person or another to do that, and eventually get to him. Steve just broke down the walls necessary to do that. So I think very early on, Steve started developing this idea of certain teams of people doing tasks that were sort of multifunctional people that could come together and operate. And he ran his whole business life around that. These people were from different walks of life. They were different ages, but he had worked with them, had confidence in them, and to get into that team, you had to really demonstrate that you could perform. And many of the people that were on Steve's team had been there for years and years and years. Today, I mean, when he went back the second time, and so. It was Steve not really seeing the old models work and try to break those down, and still there has to be some structure to most organizations and companies, but that structure often becomes a cultural way of life.
Yeah. And
it becomes binding, and I ran into that in many big companies that I worked with. If you worked with one group, they couldn't work with another. And in fact, quite frankly, back in the early 2000s, or late 90s, when Steve went back to Apple, there was an article in Time magazine in which Steve is quoted as saying, he wants this company to become the digital Sony. And I just happened to have dinner with the president of Sony at the Fairmont here in the area later that year. And we were talking, and we started talking about how structures enable creativity. And I said, but you have everything within Sony. You do have all of the various technologies. You have all of the, but then he went on to tell me that it's all siloed, and that they all work in their own realms, and that getting them to work together was the biggest task he had at Sony. And that was, why wouldn't have Sony gone after the personal computer, since it was a miniaturized, it wasn't the big box console radio or TV, it was the it was the Walkman. Sony always came out with miniaturized, small, nice, smartly designed, and that was Apple in the digital worlds. But they actually usurped that from Sony, and the reason was that Sony had built so many structures internally, they weren't able to converse with each other, and able to say, hey, here's what we're doing. How can we work together? And that takes a long time with established organizations. And, I don't want to be too openly critical, but I think that's HP. the HP way became, when they became a big company, became so highly structured and layered that many people within the organization didn't know what the other one was doing. And I think and didn't allow a lot of freedom within the individual operations. They used to say that the people that really exercised freedom at HP were the people that were up in their, in Idaho or wherever their plants were up north. And so they were away from the main plant here. And so there was a time when we were helping HP with a I'm getting off board here, but it was a time when we were supposed to help them plan for their new computer programs that were coming out. They were risk-based computers. And I had a call from the chairman, called the chairman of HP Europe. He said he was in California, he wanted to come see me. And I said, oh, okay. And I said, I'll come see you. He said, no, I'll come see you. He came up to my office, and he says, I understand you're doing this work on, he says, don't come to Europe. We don't want any part of that. So he was basically telling me, don't bring whatever you're doing with the corporate out to Europe. They were operating in their own way. And so, there's this lack of sort of crosstalk, there's lack of freedom, lack of a common culture across organizations. And I think Steve built that common culture very early because he basically had everybody charged up around something and innovative, and they all wanted to participate. Yeah. I mean, that's true even today. People still wanted to, emulate that that fire that Steve created within the company.
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about the IPO now. It's because it's less than 5 years after the company was even formed. Now,
right.
Today, maybe that's not seen as such a feat because companies here in the Valley do get formed and achieve the unicorns, as they're called today,
yeah.
and IPO in that amount of time. But that was pretty incredible back then. Talk a little bit about what it was like to be a part of that whole process of getting ready to take Apple public.
Well, there's a lot you just can't do or say. So from our standpoint, from a marketing standpoint, it's really subdued because everything is looked at and measured by the attorneys. In fact, I remember a meeting at our place in which we were kind of having fun signing some programs around with Steve there, and none of it could we take public because they were in a period of silence. And so much of what you would like to do, you have to be quiet about. Just historically, Morgan Stanley took them public. It was the first time Morgan Stanley had ever taken a startup, and particularly one in Silicon Valley, public. A venture-backed public. So, and that was Ben Rosen, because Ben Rosen was the analyst there, and Ben Rosen's the one that introduced Apple to the rest of Morgan Stanley. So it was Ben that was responsible for getting Apple, which was one of their biggest IPOs that they've ever experienced. And so there was this legacy that from back on which we were meeting with Ben, and he was part of the Apple II and so forth, early program of the Apple II. So he was able to take that into Morgan Stanley. So to get somebody, a prestige firm like Morgan Stanley, to take them public was, number one, a real coup in itself. The public offering changes the company in a lot of ways, because now, as I tell my clients, from going from sort of one boss of a company, you now have thousands of bosses, and that's your stockholders, tens of thousands, maybe millions, as well as the analysts from all the people who are recommending and companies that are buying and selling your stock. So you got it ends up being who's driving your business, and if it's purely quarter to quarter profits and quarter to quarter growth, you may not hit that, but you are restricted, and you may do things that you wouldn't otherwise do if you weren't public. So a la Elon Musk now talking about going private. because I think the pressures that people want to put on him because he's a public company, he's no longer feels in control of his company. And he would like to get his innovations to the marketplace and not worry about profitability at this point. And I think that when you go public, like as Apple did, now you're in the spotlight, and even more so than before. So the people start really, particularly the analysts, start calling, they start making appointments, they start interviewing everybody, so everybody has to be better prepared. And that's where we would come in helping to, prepare those presentations and so forth.
How did it change Steve?
Steve even alluded to this in one of the interviews that he had later on, the video interviews, that it made him more independent. I mean, he was always scratching for money. He didn't have a lot of money. His parents didn't have a lot of money, but just in one day he becomes, a millionaire, and that's something that just happened overnight. But now, he can buy the things he wants to buy. Although Steve was very frugal, he didn't, he bought a big house up in the hills, but you go in it and there's nothing in it except a piano and, and a mattress on the floor, and so he ate a very he lived a fairly frugal life at that time, and but he was able to act independently, and he could be much more aggressive in dealing with his overseers, because he had that independence. And
did he talk to you about that?
No, I don't recall. I mean, I don't think so. I don't think so. He later on said that when asked that same question publicly, he said, well, I was able to become more independent, but then once he said that, I could reflect back on how he became more independent.
Yeah.
And it was sort of from that stage that I think the Mac idea and so forth, he was ready to kind of steamroller ahead on that.
Yeah. In 1983, you joined Apple as a non-operating executive.
Right.
What did that mean, and how did that come about?
Well, I mean, I think it was just because of, quite frankly, because of Steve and I having such a personal relationship, and we met a lot, we talked a lot.
How often were you meeting with him?
Well, I'm sure I saw him a couple times every week.
Yeah.
If not more. Again, and when Steve wanted to do something, it didn't matter what time of the day or night. He was there.
He'd drop by your house?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my whole family knew Steve and admired him. So I mean, he was, he was very nice, particularly to my wife, and they actually would spend a long time talking. I think he wanted somebody. I think that he could. That's again his team. He could feel confident in, and being there. And that's why he invited me later on, even when I wasn't with Apple, into some meetings, because he felt, he'd be comfortable with people that he knew would give him an honest opinion. And there weren't that many people. There weren't that many people who would do that.
Well, and in fact, you did that from the very beginning, right? You were just honest and open with Steve, and that was the basis of your whole relationship.
Well, certainly in the beginning, it's easier for me because they're not a big client. I mean, you never want a big client to dominate your thinking processes. Yeah. And it's like when I lost Microsoft, it didn't bother me at all, because I didn't like the pressures of, I'm a big client. Therefore, you think this way or do it our way. And the whole idea is to be valuable to them. You have to give them outside in advice and opinion.
Yes.
I mean, you don't have to sort of tell them they're idiots if they don't do it, but I mean, you can present it in a nice way.
So now in '83, you're really part of the senior staff. You're going to the senior staff meetings.
Every
You're
Wednesday morning.
There every Wednesday morning. How did that affect what you just talked about, the ability to just be frank and be straight and give independent guidance?
Actually, even more.
You felt more.
Well, I had more knowledge. I mean, I got the same reports that the rest of the staff got. I knew what the numbers were. I knew what the forecasts were. I knew what the following month was going to be like. I mean, I have notes on all this, and of course on that staff I had people like Bill Campbell, and Bill and I had become very close when he moved to there. He was from my hometown, Pittsburgh. We were both basically around the same age, and we got to know each other very early, and we spent a lot of time together.
Because he joined as VP of Marketing.
He joined as VP of Marketing, and Bill didn't know how to get to, University Avenue and on the peninsula, and so I introduced him to a lot of people, and I encouraged him to do what I did, and that is learn from other people. And when Bill became Vice President of Marketing, he spent a lot of his time out in the marketplace. He went out, visited all the dealers and the distributors, went to third-party software people, and Bill's a very bright guy, and he just spent an enormous amount of time pulling information in. And Bill was probably less tactful than I am in terms of presenting the true picture. He was very direct and very to everybody, and so.
What was his big concern at that time in that period, '83, '84?
His big concern was just learning the business.
Yeah.
Because he was at that time. They had also brought on Floyd Kwame, and I think Bill reported into Floyd Kwame, or at least Floyd was there, so Floyd was helping him too. And I think Bill was just trying to get on board as quickly as he could. It's not an easy business to learn, because.
And this was even before the Mac was introduced,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
This was just when it was just growing organically with the Apple II.
Yeah, and the Apple II was an extremely successful product. There were follow-ons to the Apple II. The product had about a 10-year life cycle, which is enormous for any product at that time. And it was loved by people. I mean, people didn't want to give them up. Years and years later, they were still in many schools across the world.
Yeah.
It was a solid product, and in terms of particularly as it evolved with more memory and you could put in these application cards and things of that nature. And there were a lot more peripheral companies out there producing products for it. So it became a little ecosystem in its own right. And that ecosystem continued to grow.
I think what I was trying to get to with the question about joining the senior staff too was it just underscores that you were doing much more than marketing strategy, and you always had. I mean, for you, marketing strategy and business strategy you couldn't tease those two apart. They were exactly the same thing. And that's really what you were doing at Apple at that time, right? That's why Steve wanted you at the table. You were talking about business strategy.
Right.
You were a major strategist.
Yeah, I mean, the fact of the matter is, in Silicon Valley, if you were there wasn't much respect for people who weren't engineers. In fact, it's still struggled today. There's not a lot of respect for people who are in, let's say, the advertising world, or they like their creativity, and they admire it, and they use it. But in terms of it back then, anyway, that was just a sort of necessary evil to get stuff out. They were vendors, and most of the people who did that work up until probably I started my business were called vendors. And the whole idea was not to be a vendor, but to be if I could have gotten rid of the advertising bit, which I eventually did, earlier on I would have, but you couldn't make any money just talking to people and giving them advice. That was consultants, and consultants were next to or down at the level of I think trust lawyers, and so you had to offer some way of doing things tangible that they could see and visibly use, and that you paid your business for. But in effect, I kept trying to bring on people with greater and greater experiences and deeper experiences to work with those clients, and eventually got there, but it took a long while, and I was doing it by just simply personal relationships with these people, spending time with them, talking to them about it, and them telling me their deep secrets.
And keeping them secret.
And keeping them secret. I never really worried about that because, there was an instance in which I had dinner with Bill Gates, and he was concerned about my company working with other software company, he asked me what makes me think I could keep all of this proprietary, and not have cross conversations. And I said, well, I told him he taught me that, and he looked at me, he thought I was crazy. And I said, but you work with Compaq, you work with Apple, you work with IBM, you work with all these companies, they're all competitors. I said, so what makes you think your ethics are better than mine? And that's when he fired us. I'm joking, but well, no, that is what I said. And but there is that concern. But I always said that when the marketing and the promotion, yes, it's vital, and you do get information, but it's not anything like having people consulting to you on product development or manufacturing skills and things of that nature, who really are in the guts of your system, and you use the same vendors for all of those. If you're building a fab, you basically will use the same vendors. And so it's in people's mind as to whether or not there's this line that can't be crossed. But McKinsey and most of the consulting firms have done it for years. They've worked for competitive companies. They simply build different teams around them. And I actually brought in people from McKinsey. Tom Peters came and lectured to us. I invited people that I knew out of McKinsey back in those days, and to talk about how we would do that, and not violate the rules of confidentiality. So yeah, it was a concern, but I think we handled it fairly well.
You mentioned the lack of respect that non-engineers often experience in Silicon Valley. Steve Jobs was not an engineer either. Do you think that's why the two of you related to each other in a way that was unique to the two of you?
Well, you could talk with Steve about literature. You could talk to Steve about art. You could talk to Steve about politics. You could talk to Steve about a wide range of general interest topics that would be interested to people who are not just focused on developing the next product. And you could talk to Steve about the products. So Steve...
At a deep technical level, too. It's not that he
well,
wasn't technical.
he learned it pretty much the same way, that I did, and that was through osmosis. But his was intense in one area, in terms of trying to understand how that whole world of the small computer was evolving and what the future of it was. When you were in my position, I was working with 15 or 20 different industries, from biotech to computers to semiconductors, and so you're working in different industries, and you know a little bit about everything, and not a lot about any one of them. So, but we could have conversations outside of that, and I would say at the Valley in those days, there was very few people that you could talk about, art and design and graphics and things of that nature with outside of Steve.
When was it clear to you what a compelling public personality he could be, and how how great a face of a company like Apple Steve Jobs could actually be?
Well, I don't know that that it appeared, but I came across an article, and I think it was something like 1976, and it was in the New Yorker, where the On the Town column, and the author had gone to one of these homebrew clubs meetings, or it was a small computer gathering of some sort. I don't remember exactly what. And he's talking about the people he was meeting and how young they were, and he was a bit of skeptic that this was going to be something real, but how these people were acting as if it were going to be real. And he said he came across this 21-year-old kid. Oh no, he came across this young man who introduced himself as vice president of manufacturing and marketing, I think, and his name was Steve Jobs. And he said, and Steve, I asked him about these computers, and Steve went on to talk about it as the Polaroid camera of the future. It's like the Kodak Brownie. It's going to become the automatic. Everybody's going to have it. It's going to become so and so. He said, and they're going to be in every school. He's talking to him, and he said to the guy, and Steve said, I wish I had a computer when I was in school, a young man in school. And the guy says to him, well, how old are you? And he says, I'm 21. So he left that as sort of the punchline. Here's a guy talking about the good old days when he was a kid in school.
21.
He wished that I'm 21. Steve obviously had that gift, if you want to call it that, and I think it probably was. Another one, and this was very, very early that I brought. This was Playboy used to have a yearly electronics issue. It was a catalog in which they put all new products and things of that nature in. And they had a Playboy panel that they interviewed, and this was in 1980. And I don't know when in 1980, it didn't have the month on it. And they brought in 5 people from industry. And the 5 are Isaac Asimov, which is, the scientist, writer. There's a guy named Carver, there's a guy named Gates, not Bill Gates, and a guy named Kloss. And they were all presidents of large entertainment companies, stereos, speakers, those kinds of things. And they were asking them what the future holds. And as they were wrapping it up, they all gave their opinion about what the next stereo was going to look like, or the next so and so. And Steve, I'll just give you the one line he said. Our goal is to create a computer system that a person can use without introducing the new problem of learning how to use it. That's in 1980.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really prescient.
That is.
And here he is. I think he's 21 there. So he's a young man. He's able to stand up with these people and essentially come across as probably the most, the one with the most potential vision that would become reality, because the rest of those businesses that they had were gone.
And with the exception of Asimov, they're all long gone, long forgotten.
Yeah, and nobody knows who they are.
You wrote, the sentence that I have down here is the initiative to apply the word personal to computers and persist in using it was undeniably Steve Jobs's.
Yeah, I think Steve had called a meeting to discuss this whole idea of, and there was a lot of people were debating, is it a hobby, is it a home computer or a hobby computer? And a lot of people adopted the term home computer because that meant it's reaching a broader audience. Hobby was still a niche, a very small niche. And the whole idea was, but by the time we had that meeting, it was pretty generally referred to as home computing. And Steve wasn't happy with that name, and he kept using this term, one person, one computer, And so we had a meeting. I remember it was a little jammed conference room at Apple, and I don't know, there was maybe 10 people jammed in a room, 7 to 10 people, and we had one of our think sessions, and it was writing on the board and putting names up and saying what we should do, and leading off with Steve sort of driving the meeting, and the one person, one computer, and it arrived at this personal computer was the word that made a lot of sense, and I can't honestly say who, and maybe that's a good thing because it was really part of that Steve Jobs team, and but he was clearly the one who drove it and made the meeting possible, and wanted to discuss the subject, and is the one who said that's it. So when we walked out of that room, everything was then referred to as a personal computer. As John Kennedy said, success has many fathers. Failure is an orphan. So I think when we're talking about Apple at all, or Steve Jobs, there are so many different opinions, and I think it's because so many people want to touch that success, and no matter how slight a portion. And so, I'm still amazed at some of the people who will take walking by and handshake with Steve into a book.
The backdrop to this period, 81 to 83, the IPO, the time that you joined the exec staff, really have a seat at the table. By that time, IBM had introduced the IBM PC, and so the war was on, the Apple II versus the IBM PC. What was the environment like? What did you witness and see and experience in that whole period?
It's an interesting period because, don't forget, my other important client was Intel.
That's right.
And I was on the team that was putting together the program that eventually led to get the IBM business. And it was specifically talking about how to get that business. And, so there was the ability to try to separate two worlds and keep them that way. So I didn't necessarily know what IBM was going to do, but I knew what processor that was probably going to end up in their machine. From Apple's standpoint, they by that time we weren't doing their advertising. Jay Chiat was, and they ran an ad that says, "Welcome IBM to the personal computer business," which people have sort of, and it was sincere. The feeling was that Steve felt that this was going to broaden the industry and create a bigger industry, which it did, which it absolutely did. But it almost sunk Apple in the course of that, because the software people followed the standard, and Microsoft and Intel, the Wintel system became the standard, and that's where all the developers started moving their applications. That particular period, though, I think when IBM came in, there was this sort of feeling of it will broaden the industry. Maybe it was we knew that somebody was going to come in. In fact, from the early days, I don't know if we put IBM on the list, because at the time the people who were really developing products or consumer products, TI was doing a calculator and games. Even National Semiconductor was creating games. Sony was certainly toying with that area. So there were probably a half a dozen companies that they expected would enter that business, and with significant resources. The IBM thing was I think at first not really well understood, because you got to remember that the people at Apple, none of them were from IBM, or none of them lived in that world, and none of them ever had to compete with IBM. So they were young hobbyists who had already kind of gone their way. and said, no, we're different. We're doing it a different way. And even though in the long run that proved to be the better way, because the IBM led to commoditization and lower prices, and it just simply drove everybody out of the business, including IBM. The feeling at that time was there's more competition coming in, and that it would be a more intense business. There wasn't any fear, and maybe that was the downside, but there really wasn't a fear of it until about, well, probably until 84, 85. And that, when Steve sort of tried to turn the Mac into the IBM killer. It's why the 1984 commercial was around IBM. It was really a symbolic of IBM. And so, but that period of time with the Apple II was selling well. The company was doing very well financially, continued to grow. And the marketplace liked the Apple II. So they felt that they had an advantage over IBM. And there was probably a bit of technical arrogance there as well, and hubris. And so there wasn't any kind of special meetings around, well, IBM's in the business, what do we do now? I think it went on business as usual.
You knew big East Coast companies, and certainly there were other people on the Apple board who understood how these things worked. What these cautionary voices who were saying, well, but this is IBM. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. Was that falling on deaf ears?
Well, it wasn't necessarily so, because IBM's forecast, even with its mainframes, was for, I think, something like they were going to sell 3 of them, and so their ability to plan and look at the future. Plus, the IBM PC wasn't done in the normal IBM channels. They completely went outside for everything, which was contrary to everything they'd ever done. They made their own CPUs. They made their own memory. They built all the pieces. They developed their own software and so forth. So initially, that wasn't necessarily known that they were going to that they were going to go outside, and a guy named Dick Eldridge became sort of an entrepreneur, and he was treated like an entrepreneur at the various computer conferences. And so you learn more about it as you went to these computer conferences, and you began to and then the dealers' feedback. So it really was a process of getting feedback, gradual feedback from the marketplace, which Bill Campbell did, and began to educate people about the real nature of the marketplace. That's not uncommon in any business where the field is going to become crowded. There were 50 disk drive companies at that point in the valley. I think, what is there now, 1 or 2, and so at the beginning of these things, there's a proliferation of ideas and technologies. Lots of people were still trying to build small computers. There was dozens of sort of laptops and smaller format computers that were being developed. I mean, we did, even at my company, we saw lots of them, and so they were coming, and we knew it was going to be a crowded field, and it would just change the nature of your competitive posture, and it meant you had to grow faster, you had to have more, better products than the competition, and you had to build an organization that was capable of doing the marketing and distribution and sustaining the environment. So I think it was sort of business as usual, but business as usual here, when you have fast rising competitors, is not like business as I was told later on by the president of Motorola, when Intel turned its whole business around in a matter of a month to compete with the microprocessor in the personal computer field. He said it would have taken me that long to get a ticket to go back and talk to my management from an airplane, from all the bureaucracy I had to go through. So, things don't move fast in those companies. And so they didn't think that IBM would move as fast as it did. but the way they set up their business allowed them to move faster. They still had problems with Bill Gates. I think there was a lot of fighting going on between Bill and IBM over the software. I don't have notes on that, but I have direct conversations with the IBM people who were in that meetings. One of them was the president of IBM at the time was a friend of mine. And so they were pretty long, drawn out, fighting, screaming. And I'm surprised they even kept the relationship.
Was the issue about whether to license it or own it, was that the main
Yeah.
issue? Yeah. One final question. You mentioned earlier about being deeply embedded in Intel, working on processors that were eventually going to go to the PC world, and then deeply embedded in Apple, working on all these other things. Early on, did you just reconcile in your own mind, look, I'm gonna have a foot in each one of these camps, and I'm not going to worry about it? How did you deal with that? Because it was critical that you did.
I didn't make those kind of judgments about what would succeed and what wouldn't succeed. We evaluated each one on its own merits, and also I didn't make judgments about the futures of companies. I mean, in the 70s, I was doing work for an AI company. John Markoff, I recognize, had written about this company in his book, recent book. It didn't succeed, but I didn't say, do I think AI will? I mean, we all thought that it was going to become a success years from then, from that period. But it was somebody who was trying to make it happen in a wrong time and place. And so I do think that time and place are significant, and that you have to play your hand in that time and place, or you'll lose it. And it's very easy, because you could be out of this business for 5 years and you're gone. I think that's the way it was then. If we saw an opportunity with an Intel that we were working with in every country of the world, and we'd put office in Europe for them and in Portland for them. We had a lot of big staff of people working for them, and we worked as almost as employees, because we were there every day and we had people embedded in the company. And we felt the same way with Apple. We didn't necessarily put it in other parts of the world, but our office that we had put in Europe for Intel then was there for Apple. And indeed, the fellow we were working with at Intel, who was the head of European marketing for Intel, became the head of Apple's marketing in Europe. And Mike Spindler, who also worked at Intel Europe, and then became an employee in Europe, and then eventually came back here and became president. So there was a lot of crosstalk in terms of people transferring from the semiconductor industry to the computer industry, and there were people from Intel that went to work at Apple as well, particularly in product marketing. So and investor, Hank Smith, on the board. So he ran the microprocessor marketing at Intel.
And then became a key director at Apple.
Became a key director at Apple.
Yeah.
And so Hank knew that I was on both, and I had meetings even.
Well, and Mike Markla had come out of Intel, and
yeah, and Mike was running. It was the product marketing of memory, but he knew a lot of Intel people. He's the one that introduced Art Rock to it, and Art put money in. So, that those connections were fairly close, and there were years and years of efforts on everybody's behalf, including Mike's and mine's and others, to get Intel to use or get Apple to use Intel's processors, or at least look at them or to do something. But there was a reticence to. They did finally do it, but it was about 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think they started.
It didn't happen at that time. which is kind of amazing when you, as you point out, you look at the amount of shared DNA between early Intel and early Apple. It's
Very high.
It's
Art
pretty
Rock was on both
amazing.
boards.
Yeah.
And so, but many of the board members were people that were friends or had become friends, and I would meet with them privately, and Art Rock and I would. That's how we got to know each other, simply because of talking both about Intel and Apple, and he was just curious to know what my opinions and views were. But I did that with the guy who was also running Venrock and most of them. And when Steve was at Next, I knew several of his board members. I used to have breakfast with them before their meetings over at Next, including Ross Perot. I've had breakfast with Ross Perot talking about Apple, and so I got around.
As further evidence of how early and deeply embedded you were in Apple, you brought in an org chart. I want to just have you show and talk about that before we finish this segment.
I honestly didn't recall this as the meeting itself. Let me dig it out here for a second. I'm not supported like that. There it is. But as I was going through the computer files of my notebook scans, I came across this one, and the date is 11/8, and it says 78, but I think that might have been misread. I used to just put the month and the day on my notebooks, but then I have to guess what the date is, and I put that on there, but I think it may have been 77 rather than 78. But in any event, the meeting was, it says Apple status meeting, and it was Mike Markkula, Don Valentine, who was on the board of Apple. It was Hank Smith of Venrock, Steve Jobs, Henry Singleton, who was the chairman of Teledyne, which was a very large, successful telecommunications company, and that link was Art Rock, because Art, I think, had been an investor in that company, and Mike Scott, who was from National Semiconductor. He was sort of a general manager over there, and they brought him on as president.
Yeah, Mike,
of Apple.
I think, personally recruited Scott to come over and be president.
Yeah. And Mike, I think, really always wanted to kind of work himself out of a job. I mean, he had other investments, he had other things he was doing, and I think he wanted to do his stint at Apple short term, and he did. I mean, as I said, they even worked they washed windows. He was right there at the early stages, but I think he felt that it needed full-time management, and there was sort of always a reluctance to let Steve do that. They felt he was too young, too impetuous, too mercurial, and so they were always looking for somebody, kind of, who could, be the disciplinarian, I guess, or the adult in the room.
And how did you feel about that?
Well,
at the time,
I'd seen entrepreneurs who overcame that and grew. It just was a matter of time. But once you get venture people involved, and the whole idea of going public, then there's as I said, it changes the priorities of the board to have a solid hold on the disciplines of the company, from financial to development and so forth. And I think that kind of pressure now creates the need for a more structured, that makes them feel secure to have that more structured. And I think they felt unstructured by Steve's sort of, creative and innovative and flow of things. rather
Crossing
than-
boundaries,
Yeah,
as
crossing
you said.
boundaries. And they never felt comfortable with that. And if you know some of these people, they are very sort of strict and disciplined people in their own businesses. And so I think they liked what Steve had to contribute in terms of sort of marketing the company and being a spokesman and understanding it. I think Steve wanted to be more than that. And I think he felt, and he even said, and I have that in my notes, that no one really taught me how to be a CEO or to be a manager. I had to learn this all on my own. And since it was my own company, nobody ever countered me. And so as a result, I was able to do what I want. And in fact, he says if I were at a Kodak or a big company, he said they would have tossed me out a long time ago. So he understood that, and he understood he knew what he didn't know. I think one of the problems with Steve was that he never really let on what he didn't know too overtly, and so people made assumptions about it. And
it sounds like, in particular, they assumed he knew more than he really did.
No, I don't think that was it. I think that they saw him as he acted and as he was. And I don't think Steve was about to tell everybody everything he did know. He kept a lot to himself and in reserve. And I think that his vision for Apple was to go steps further. And so, when he had an opportunity and he saw the potential technology particularly coming out of Xerox PARC, the mouse and the pull-down menus and such and such, I think it was that vision from the 80s of developing a computer that you don't have to learn how to use. And I think that was his ultimate goal, and he wanted to stick by it. He didn't know how to get there, and he couldn't probably have articulated very well how to get there or what he needed to do that. And I think that's what they would say, is that if that's your goal, you've got to spell it all out and put all the boxes around it and budgets and so forth like that. And I don't think Steve had that as yet in mind. And it really did take some fermenting for Steve to mature in those ways. Unfortunately, but anyway, they have an organizational chart here that put Mike Scott as the top, and so he would be the president and CEO. And they had the finance guy was to be announced. Tom Whitney was director of engineering. And not Roaz, but Tom Whitney. Jobs was the new product development was under Steve Jobs. That was on the chart. And then down below was product engineering was Rod Holt, and off of that same line, Steve Wozniak was R&D. And so there were some other boxes down below, but it was sort of the organizational chart. And as I said, I think this was probably, and I've got to do some checking on this, the way they transcribed those files and put dates on them, I found a lot of other discrepancies. So I think this probably was 77. I'll have to look when Mike Scott came on. But the company was a going concern when Scott came on, and whatever the sense of urgency from people, it wasn't necessarily felt within the company that it was necessary. And Scott was clearly the wrong guy, because this was a team collective, and collective is a good term, I think, for that. And
kind of in the Berkeley sense of a collective.
Yeah. And I said, and I used to say this, that Apple wasn't so much of a company as it was a happening, like Woodstock. everybody came together and it was good music. And so I think Scott came on. He's a tough manager. He comes out of the national mode of management, which is do a good job and you can keep it. And that's an actual saying. And so it's a tough environment, and it's really structured, and it's a hard environment. And Scott tried to sort of lay that on the Apple, and he just got a lot of pushback, and certainly not good feedback. And he treated vendors pretty miserably too. There's this one story, and it's published, I think, that Digital Equipment was supposed to have, they had ordered a VAX from Digital Equipment for manufacturing. And I don't know, it was 3 months late or 2 months late. It was late anyway. And so Mike Scott sent a black funeral wreath to Ken Olsen and said, "This is where your business is headed."
Wow. Was he at Apple at that point, or was he still?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's why he did it. Yeah. So I mean, he had pretty strong opinions and ways, and I mean that probably worked in semiconductor business, didn't work and particularly in the new kind of culture that was being built at Apple. It did go through rough waters for a while, and it really is. Someone up there must have been looking down kindly on it, because it survived about 10 years of disaster, 8 years anyway. And I think most people, including Michael Dell, when asked what he thought Steve should do with the company whenever he came back, Michael Dell said, "I'd have him sell all the assets and give the money back to the stockholders." I think he's swallowing those words now, but quite a few people counted Apple out, and it was a lot of Steve's magic that made it happen. There's no other explanation for it. His ability, well, we can talk about that later, but his ability to change things there without stock and without a lot of financial influence, it was quite amazing.
Quite amazing. Let's talk about the birth of the Mac. You, as when we were talking earlier, you talked about Steve envisioning the Mac in the middle of all this other turmoil that was going on within Apple, and the story of the pirate ship and the pirate flag and all of that, I think, is well told. We don't have to cover that here. I want to pick it up actually with where you begin in your some things you've written, where he drops in on you at home on a Saturday morning, and he takes you to this secret workspace, and he says, "I've got this project I want to show you." Can you talk a little bit about that, and
Sure.
and how the Mac all came about from your perspective?
Well, we know that that some of the technology that had been around, there were a couple people that were talking about the future of computing technology and the ability to create a better interface. And that work was done not only at Xerox PARC, but also at SRI, and some at Stanford, and some other places were also doing it. So there was this whole effort to try to make the complexity more accessible to a broader audience of people. And again, that's in kind of the ferment here that was going on. So, and Steve certainly was in that ferment, so he understood that there was stuff, and that's why I think when he went to Xerox, he had knowledge that there was some unique ways of doing things there. And while I said I I really think, in a way, Steve Jobs saved Xerox. They didn't save him, because as you and I talked before, he paid for that meeting with stock in Apple that they no doubt did well on, and Steve was able to take that into the marketplace and make a reality of it. And as I said, I know the people at Xerox like to claim it being the origin, and I'm sure I understand that. It's this touch of success they always want to have, and not have it just recirculate itself in a lab. But as I said, if a tree it falls in a forest and nobody's around, does anybody hear it? And I think that sound comes when you have an audience, and I think Steve created the audience. And what he had was when he was doing the Apple II, he certainly learned a lot about the computer business, because that became a worldwide business. It became a world of developers. It became a world where IBM was a chief competitor. So he sort of understood what had to be done. And I think that the other thing that was driving him, and this is my sort of my own opinion that I'm putting on it, but I think Steve wanted to, just to go back a second, my org chart that I was showing, Steve was head of new product development. And I think he took that seriously, and he was going to do the product that goes beyond the Apple II. And Wozniak had moved out of the company, actually, despite what people think. I mean, he left the company very, very early. And I think it was around 81 or 82 that he had left Apple. And the new product would be Steve's, whole and entire. He would be the one that drove it. He would be the one that conceptualized much of it, and he would develop the R&D, drive the R&D process. And so, just as the Apple II became sort of something that was created by Woz and that particular team at the time, Steve was sort of a support function. Steve now became the main driving force. And that's what I think he wanted to do, because I think he thought he would learn a great deal by becoming that driving force for the whole product. But when he first came over and took me to that lab, there wasn't really much to see. It was a bench full of cards and tubes with electrical impulses showing across them and so forth. But he was all thrilled with it, and he showed me this card that was a beautiful circuit card, and it was well designed and so forth. I mean, and so every little bit of it he was proud of. And even though it was that early and there wasn't really much to see, he really he was into it in a big way, even from that point. So every little step along the way, he was both learning as well as contributing, I'm sure, in terms of driving the engineers. Okay, can you make the performance better than that, or can you add the functionality of that, or can you do this? And so his way of learning was sort of the Socratic method of asking the question and taking it back and then giving it back to them at one step higher. And I think that's the way he operated, and he drove it. The Mac, actually, our first meeting was, I think it was in 82 maybe. No later than 83, but I think it was 82 was the first meetings around the Mac. It wasn't called the Mac, but it was early planning. And so literally before it came out, there was almost 3 years of planning went into the launch of the Mac. So it was the one product in which we were able to really look at all of the ways that you might bring a product into the marketplace with the development of an infrastructure. And so there were, once it was developed and we were getting ready, there were individual meetings with software developers and given insight into what the product was going to be and what it looked like, some preliminary views into it, although Apple, and I think Steve was keeping it fairly under wraps. They wouldn't do anything without a non-disclosure agreement signed. But I think there were probably at least maybe more 50 or more developers that were given individual presentations on what the Mac was going to be and what it was, and commitments came out of it. Bill Gates said when he first saw that presentation that if it came about, there at least 50% of Microsoft's future products would revolve around that product. And with that commitment, and he later on said that publicly, that really gave a lot of impetus to other suppliers to develop third-party software around it. The early meetings that were planned were miniature seminars like Apple did. Well, they launched the first one at the annual meeting here, but then there were similar ones done around the country with sponsors by dealers. So I have some photos of one that was in Texas, in Dallas, and they had planned on 100 people attending, and instead they got 400 people attending. So everywhere they went in New York was even, I think people lined up on the street. So there was enough leaked out there about various aspects of what was coming, and that made it very, very successful. The thing that from our standpoint was planning was how do you launch a product with a reference base, and that was having. I always felt that journalism was he said, you said journalism, because they always quote people for references, and the people they quote are users, third-party developers, partners, and those sorts of things. So I always felt you educate those people first before you go to the media. You educate your infrastructure, and we did hundreds of presentations to people before we actually went into the public across the country. The initial Macs, when it came out, we put into the hands of well over 100 sort of opinion makers. Got early, gave them the Macs, and those people then became reference points and said, I've used it, here's what it does. So that when you go to the media, then they reflect that. And there was probably, we came up in our own mind with, 20 stories about the development of the Mac and its uses and its applications. And instead of, the press would always like to have an exclusive. If you went to them and said, well, we've got this great product, and they'd say, great, we'll do a cover on it, or we'll do a major article on it, but we need an exclusive. So what we did was we gave them exclusives on a piece of the story. And so we had about 20 covers, I think, or maybe more, maybe 30, that ended up, and they were all with just a piece of the story. Now,
so one magazine would cover the interface.
The team.
And one would cover the
they
team.
They did a whole story on the team. One would be, Steve's views on the future of the Mac. Another one would be the applications. Another would be, I don't remember all of them, but some way or other we would split everything up and into, various pieces of the story. And it was probably the first time that sort of thing was ever done. And it was largely successful. The media coverage was worldwide, but the whole goal was to have everybody talking about the Mac within 2 weeks, and certainly worldwide, and that's what happened. Everybody was talking about it, and it became sort of a reference model. Now, there's good side and good part and bad part to that, and that is it became so successful that it had to be successful. Mm-hmm. You can't talk about something that isn't, and it certainly looked at that point. There was the Mac factory in Fremont, which was to spit these things out like they were Sony Walkman, and that was sort of the model.
That was the model.
That was the model, and but if you know the Mac, the early Macs, it was encapsulated. And so it wasn't easy you couldn't adapt it like the two. You couldn't improve the memory, or you couldn't change things very easily with it. It wasn't easy to upgrade the systems or increase the speed or do other kinds of bugs that were really in the, it was a hobby, still a hobby type product. And it had a lot of room for improvement. But it wasn't easy to do. And it took 6 months, though, because they sold a ton of them in the first 90 days. But that factory was expensive to maintain. It's spitting out inventory that you have to pay for, and it's being paid for by the Apple II group, because they were the ones that were making money, and they were the ones that were doing well and still having a strong customer base. And the Mac was just building its base. In the meantime, there was a slowdown, and actually around between 85 and over 85 and early 86, people actually stopped buying hobby, home, personal computers. The market was going like this, and then it just flattened. Dealers had a lot of inventory. They weren't able to move them. This was largely due to the fact that people needed to be educated in order to introduce a product or to buy a product. And they couldn't just take it home, plug it in, and I mean, I know enough people who tried that. It just, you just can't do it. It's okay, so what does it do? And there were very limited applications on it to begin with. So Mike Markula, in fact, I think wrote a program that he did for his wife, which was her recipes for cooking. And I used to joke, yeah, you can put that recipe on up there. You can print them out on the little 4x cords, and then buy a little metal box and put it in it, and then put it on your stove. But the fact is that there just wasn't a lot of know-how in terms of its application in the marketplace at that point. And that was sort of a stumbling block. So Steve's premonition of creating a computer that people have to educate themselves became also part of the slowdown, I think, in all the personal computer business. Plus, as I said, there was excessive inventories from from the IBM and other things that were in the marketplace at that point. So that created conflict within Apple, because the majority of the people that were working in on the Apple II, and there was the follow-on to the Apple II, and even the Lisa program, we're seeing a lot of money going into the marketing of Mac and into that factory, and so it became a conflict. And you can't really have two operating systems competing with each other under the same roof. So there was two different ways of computing. If you were a salesman, you wanted to sell into the local high school your Apple II, which already had a track record in education. Now you want to sell the Mac into education. From a corporate standpoint, which one focuses on the education market, and which dealers do you sort of tell to sell this way or sell that way, or price? So it became competition within Apple for those products, and of course the Apple II people felt they were winning. They were on the leading edge. They were doing it. This one has yet to really prove itself, except for that first, I'd say 90, maybe 3 months to 5 months that Apple, the Mac, really was booming.
And this is where I think it's so interesting that you were on the senior staff at
Right.
Apple, serving as someone who was helping to think through all these issues. Can you give me a flavor of what the discussions were like, and how those things were playing out in the executive staff room?
Well, there was a lot of the first developing conflict really was between Del Yoakum, who was the GM of the Apple II at that time, and Steve, because Del wanted to obviously make his product and his product line the dominant one in Apple, because it was the one producing the most revenue and income and profits. And Steve really was talking about tomorrow, but financing that was separate. So it was either headed toward two divisions or some separated. So they put it under, that's how they first put it under two different people to see how those two could evolve by themselves. There really wasn't an easy solution, since Steve was running the Mac department, and it was supposed to be the product that could supplement the Apple II. But it didn't look like it was going to supplement it because it was struggling to get its own foot into the marketplace, its own footprint. And even though it had this wonderful, there's always the old advertising saying that the ad won all the awards, but the company went bankrupt. So yeah, it got a lot of kudos and a lot of credit for getting it out there. The concept of the mouse, the concept of pull-down menus, the concept of graphics in a computer, the concept of different fonts, and much more of a creative product for artists and architects and people of that nature. But it had to be a successful product, and its success was being called into question because it just wasn't selling at the same volumes. And you need volume production to cut costs. It's just the way it is. And that wasn't happening fast enough. And so every meeting was tempers, and every meeting was going back and forth, and it just intensified over time.
Now, John Sculley had arrived on the scene by this time, hadn't he?
Yes.
How did that change things from your perspective?
From my perspective, this gets a little bit into the personalities of people, but John really didn't have a contribution to make. He came out of the consumer soft drink world. It's a totally different world than the computer world. He didn't want to, I think, let on that he didn't know that world, because if he did, it would be a weakness. He put all of his faith for the first, 2 years or so in Steve, and Steve was sort of his idol and his model, and so he pretty much tried to. He only listened to Steve, and that was said in the room. You only listen to Steve. You just tolerate everybody else. And
that was said to Sculley
yeah.
in these staff meetings.
Yeah, Bill Campbell said it. And Bill had no problem in speaking up and speaking his mind. And in fact, there was I think a Newsweek story that when they broke up, somewhere I have it, I thought, yeah, here it is. Oh, no, it isn't. Okay, I'm sorry. But it shows Steve and Sculley, picture of them together as friends, and was saying, and so it got out into the news. This is what I was telling you before about Apple being played out in the public as a story. It was like an afternoon sitcom or soap opera. From the day it started, where Steve was out talking to, the Playboy magazine and the New Yorker, and I mean, his life started playing out in public, and everything that happened, even the revealing of Lisa being his daughter, out of wedlock by a woman that Steve dated, and that was played out in public, everything, and he wasn't happy about it, and I have notes on that in my notebook, but in fact it did happen, and so this was part of that. It kept getting leaked out that people were unhappy, that there was a lot of conflict going on between these two sides. And I don't think at that point they knew how to solve it. And it was a little bit like at Intel, where there was the memory division and there was the microprocessor, and the memory division was supporting the development of the microprocessor for 10 years, because the 4004 to basically the 8080, which happened in the early 80s, or 1980 or so, the 4004 was 1971, and for almost a decade, Intel was looking for a market for the microprocessor, whereas the memory had a solid market, solid growth, but it was being encroached on increasingly by cheaper, higher reliable memory from Asia. And so what do you do, and when do you make that decision, and how do you transfer over, and what's the risk of doing that? So you don't get into a simple pick one. It's the fact that one is supporting you and the other one is possibly supporting you in the future. And so which one do you sacrifice, which one do you invest in? It becomes a long, intense discussions, and lots of them.
Can I ask you what Steve was saying to you at the time? I mean, he looked to you for advice. He confided in you. He was seeking your counsel. What was that period like between the two of you?
Yeah, certainly, particularly when I was on there. I mean, I didn't, when I was on the executive staff, I just took off my hat as a vendor and as a supplier, and I was a member of Apple's team, and I had to take a completely nonpartisan view toward the sides, and so which I think I did pretty handily, so I didn't favor Steve's view or anybody else's. Privately, I felt that Steve just needed to make some changes to the Macintosh and make them more quickly than he was willing to do. He didn't want to make the changes fast because they were probably expensive and would take some retooling at the factory. And again, I don't think his knowledge of the whole intricate process of retooling and of improving the performance of the Mac and changing a lot of the things that were necessary was there. I think that just took a little bit of a time for him to learn. But he was confident that he would. And so Steve was never lack of confidence in his future. And Steve is totally focused and dedicated to his product and what's in front of him. And he never gives up on it. And so the other one was much more of even the people there were more, I think Gal Yoakum came out of sort of the traditional manufacturing mode and sort of so these people were just producing more of the same. The next Mac was smaller and more friendly and things like, or the next Apple II. The Apple III was a failure. That's a whole nother story, but the follow-on products after that were successful in the marketplace were a little bit smaller and had better performance in them, and so they were well accepted into the marketplace. So that balance just created a long discussion of how do you solve that problem, and people were asking Scully to kind of solve it, and I think John was reluctant to get in the middle of it.
So why didn't John want to take that on? Was it because of his respect for and relationship to Steve?
I think that was part of it. I think he didn't want to challenge Steve. I think he also knew that if he, it's almost one of these things is which half of the child do you accept? I mean, it's one is keeping the numbers going, and they're a public company, so he had to be. He's ultimately has to be responsible for that. But on the other hand, he he believes Steve's vision for things, and Steve is a great salesman, and for his vision, and I think that's where Scully was caught, but he wouldn't make a decision one way or another, and I think. When this got to a head where there was, it went to the board, and I think Scully took his concerns to the board, and they told Scully, look, you're the CEO, you're the president, you have got to make the decision, and you've got to tell Steve that he's not going to run the Mac division anymore. And so, and John came into the staff meeting and announced that. And I think he announced it to Steve first. He told him. And he said that he told Steve that he's not going to run that division anymore, and that, any more conflicts or fights, he said, then he's going to be forced to fire Steve. And so he said Steve agreed to listen 75% of the time. That was his words. I think that's a Steve Jobs, right? I mean, that is just a beautiful answer. Okay, I'll pay attention 75% of the time, but that other 25 is mine.
Yeah.
And so he wouldn't give up his little bit of turf. And in the meantime, I think Steve tried to see if he could sort of, and the people in his group were totally loyal to him. So I think he felt he could run it as a shadow GM, which I think he tried to do, and even, I mean, he tried to actually get people on the overall staff of Apple to dedicate their attention and work just to the Mac division.
Well, there's even in this staff meeting where there's a kind of him or me discussion, isn't there, where Scully calls the question and asks each one of you sitting around the table your opinion about either Scully or Jobs. Was it that same staff meeting?
It wasn't Scully or Jobs. It was, should Steve, be head of the division or the Mac division.
And Steve was in the room, and
Yeah.
Scully's polling every member of the staff.
Yeah. So, I mean, and so it was directly to Steve. And
what did you say? I mean, it's on the record.
yeah,
this would-
I felt that Steve should not be the general manager. That I was for him being sort of head of R&D, head of product development.
And you had to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I had told Steve that privately. I had told him that privately, that that he could still be the a driving force. It's the difference between management and leadership. You don't have to be a manager to be a leader. But I didn't want him to go, because first of all, Woz was gone, and so the other leader had gone, the other founder. And I, at least all the companies that I had worked with, the founders were great influence on the direction of the company. And I felt strongly that you had to keep the founders there in some way. And Bill Campbell was the other one who felt this exactly the same way.
And said so in the meeting.
Yeah.
And had said so privately to Steve.
Yeah. And neither of us sort of coordinated what we were going to say, because we didn't know the question was going to be asked. But both of us were defensive of Steve in the sense that he really does have a vision for products and for the development of what's innovation. And but he needed someone to sort of manage the overall process and make it more make it more predictable, which is for forecasts, for example. I mean, to be able to forecast how many Macs you're going to build next month became a real critical thing. And at that time, it was, that way. And so it wasn't a systematic process. They kind of pulled the field and said, how many Macs do you think we can sell? And then that was sent into the national sales manager, and then he sent it to and a manufacturing manager looked at it, and everybody looked at it and then made their guess or corrected what was there, and then it ended up a number. And whether it was high or low, nobody knew.
So it had to be run as a product line, is really what you're saying.
Right.
Right, which you had seen in Intel and any number of
dozens
other
of
clients.
companies,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going back to GME. I was a manufacturing line in that company. I worked in the building with the manufacturing line. At National, it was in the back room, the manufacturing line. And I visited their manufacturing plants around the world. So it wasn't as if this was new to me. I mean, but I wasn't in the position of trying to make a judgment for the company as to which way it could go.
So in fact, he didn't leave at that point. I have a note here that 2 months after that meeting, the two of you talked, and he was starting to think about other things he might do, either within the company or outside the company. What was your sense at that point of what was going to happen?
Yeah, I think he took a trip, I think, to Russia. And
ironic.
Yeah, of all things. And I believe it or not, I think he was giving a talk there, and they had given him sort of warnings about what to talk about, and don't mention the Bolsheviks. And I think Steve immediately starts out talking about the Bolsheviks. I mean, he did just the opposite of all the rules and regulations that they gave him. I was told that later, but they were kind of trying to get him away for a while. But when he came back, he was thinking about what he does with his life. And he wanted to know, he did ask me if I thought he could become president of the United States without belonging to a political party. And my reply to him was, but first you ought to register to vote, which he had not. And so I think Steve was vitally concerned about politics, but I don't think he wanted to live with the down and dirty nature of the politics itself. And
corporate politics weren't brutal enough.
Yeah. But he stayed engaged. I mean, I was president of the California Innovation, I think it was called Innovation Association, started by Jerry Brown, and me and Jerry Brown started it. And he was on that with Dave Packard, and I think Noyce was on it, and a few other people. And it was to try to, how can we help make California a better environment for innovation? And spent time with that. And Steve was on that. He attended, I know, political meetings. He was quite active in terms of support for candidates, and even meeting with them and so forth. So. But again, it was around. It wasn't necessarily around Apple or Apple products. It was around trying to create an environment where innovation can thrive.
Did it still feel like to you, having been there from late 1976 to now, 85, did it still feel to you like Apple was his company, or did it feel like something else?
No, it was because of the two different product lines. It was beginning to sort of split apart, and there were different teams of people, and actually, the different teams of people had different backgrounds, and in the sense of the management, and so it really had become to bifurcate as a company, and it's why. And I heard this later on, and it had to do with software systems and even Oracle. Is that Oracle was buying companies, but you can't allow a company with a different fundamental core operating system to exist alongside another one in your company. If you buy a company that has one, you either have to figure a way to make them compatible, or you have to do away with one and let the rest of the company be absorbed into it. And at some point, that was how I felt, but I wasn't, at that point you couldn't tell which, only because of the questionability of the future of the Mac, and how quickly people would adopt the Macintosh technology. Because, again, you only had a window of success that was really about that wide, and Gordon Moore used to say, you never know when the window is half open or half closed, and I think that was the point that most of us felt: is the window open or is it closed, and how long will the Mac have to really right itself and become a dominant standard in the industry? And as we know, that took a lot of years, but I don't think it would have occurred within the next year. So that was the conundrum, and both products were stayed alongside each other for a while, but gradually the Apple II sort of faded just by product line and not giving it the attention that the Mac. So after Steve left, and this was Scully and the team of people that were there, just improved the Mac enough to make the improvements that the marketplace was looking for, that allowed it to have that little blip. And it did well for a while, but then again, their vision beyond that was foggy. And so it never went anywhere.
How much longer did you stay as in that role on the executive staff after Steve left?
I was on it through most of Scully's presence there, I think, into the probably about 5 years. I stayed on after, and the conflict then was really a struggle with people on the board to get John to somehow or other have a vision for where the company should go. He was early on focused mainly on stock price and revenue and the IPO, from a person who was responsible for promotion, and I don't know how soon this will be out, and I know John will react to it, but I always felt that John's feeling about Apple and himself was how much the media reflected on him. And they define themselves by their reflection. And I think there's a number of people that I know in the industry that define themselves by the media's reflection of them. That they aren't able to actually stand up on their own. People like Steve and Bob Noyce didn't care what the media said. They knew what they wanted to do, and they kept pursuing that. So, and oddly enough, I was doing all that, but I really respected the people who basically didn't need it. And you had to, because they had a mind of their own.
What was the media's reaction to John in those years?
At first, it was very, very good. John was very scripted, and
was good at being scripted.
He was good at being scripted, but not necessarily having any innate knowledge of the computer business. And so that always was sort of there, and it was always his fear, I think. Although he didn't, he wouldn't express it overtly. I think
that must have presented a lot of issues for you as the one who had to get him through this whole period as the CEO of Apple.
Yeah, because a lot of the issues that arrived were problems of the press. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? That then I get called in to try to fix that, and you don't fix it. It is what it is, and so that creates some conflicts. And although on the surface we got along, my friend Bill Campbell was also very honest and direct with me about what he heard, offline, and basically, in conversations with Bill, it made me realize that I really ought to probably step aside and not get into those meetings. John would ask me, I'd be asked the same questions as the rest of the people, and also, as you know, I took a lot of notes, and I was asked to stop taking notes, and there was sort of this, John made a reminder to me once, Regis, all this is confidential. And I'd been working for Apple for, 10 years then or 15 years, and Bill Campbell really chastised him when he said that. So I think he was uncomfortable with me there, and I felt it was time to go.
Meanwhile, your business was growing just as quickly, and you had just as many big customers more than ever, right? So was it a relief for you when you finally were able to relinquish Apple and get back to the core of RMI?
No, Apple remained a client,
yes,
and a good client. I had sold the advertising to Jay Chiat, and I did that intentionally. I picked Jay. I didn't farm my business. It was doing a substantial amount in the advertising business. I think it was over 20 million, maybe 25 million, just in advertising. That's multiplied by the actual value of the ads. But more and more people were clients, and in diverse areas. As I mentioned, almost exactly the same time that Apple, 1976, is when Genentech came onto the scene. In Genentech, the two founders I knew, or I became friends with. One was out of Kleiner Perkins. He was a partner there. Herb Boyer, who was the scientist at UCSF. We didn't know each other at first, but it turned out we went to the same college together, and we were only, I think, a year apart. And once we found that out, we got along very well. But the numbers of clients that I had, Spectrophysics, was the laser company, and they were developing a low-cost lasers that ended up being part of the scanning system for retail stores and so forth and everything. But they also stayed in the scientific instrument. It was a fascinating company. It was a really interesting company, and they were. And Sam Kalala was the president of one of the divisions. Sam is a really prominent venture capitalist here in the Valley now, and he and I worked together on trying to bring lasers into new markets. We brought it into agriculture and into construction and places like that. We worked with the company Diasonics, which created the first sonograms for use with things like fetuses and so forth. They're one of the early systems. That was also out of the Valley. It was also, I think, a Kleiner Perkins tandem computer. I could go on, but we had a lot of customers, our clients, and it kept growing, and we got clients then to start developing in other areas of the country and also in Europe.
In Europe. We're going to talk about Genentech next time. I think that's really worth going into some detail on, because I know they were every bit as important and successful as your relationships with Intel and Apple.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the companies we work with were trying to bring new technologies to market, and that's why they came to us.
They picked you.
Well, they needed somebody that at least could understand the business of what they were in. And at that time, I had hired a lot of technical people, mostly out of the trade magazines, the technical editors and journalists who were engineers who had gone, had been good writers and had gone to the journals, and I knew them. And so while the journals were mad at me, we doubled their salary, and they made pretty good money under us. And so we had a lot of those people who really you could bring into a meeting and who could ask questions at the engineering level, and and I learned a lot from them. We had one fella who used to actually give courses at my company on basic electronics and engineering, and so he had regular courses. He developed it into I think we had it into a video series, and there were times that that paid off, because the people began to learn, and educating themselves was an important thing for that period of getting to know the technology business. Because if you can't speak the language of your client, then they weren't going to be much interested in you. You then turned yourself into a vendor, and then it became a commodity and a price war. And I had somebody at Intel once that one of the head of he wasn't head of marketing, but he was a senior guy that Andy had sort of tried to bring us in, because we were in so many places at Intel. And he said to me, we did some surveys out there, and we found out you're the most expensive, marketing company that's out there. And I said, so? He said, well, I said, go find one of the other ones. I said, go do it. Because they wouldn't have been able to find anybody that could have spoke their language and had as much history in the company. And they eventually just took it in-house. But the downside of that is that you don't get much objectivity. The people inside are not going to challenge things, because it's their job is on the line.
Well, and it took them a long time to do that too, didn't it?
Oh yeah, it took a very long time.
After
and
you
they had three different people at Intel that It's Andy Grove. Andy Grove likes control, and although Andy and I, were really, I thought we got along really, really well. We met a lot. We, became, I think, fairly good friends, and we could have our differences, and I would, argue with him, more so than I ever did with Steve Jobs, and Andy sort of tolerated me, and I had to tolerate him because he produced a lot of money, but not really for that, but because Intel was they were such a significant force in the industry, and but it took them, I think, something like 7 years to get even the first semblance of taking on some function that we were doing, and that was starting in somewhere in somewhere in about 88 or 89. So I know they brought us back in later on to help with some of the Pentium, and some of the others brought our people in. And then they also hired some of the people that had left me. So, Intel we had, I think, a long-term influence on Intel.